conference focusing on black indigent health care. Up next, we begin our coverage of Hofstra University Symposium on the Nixon presidency with the remarks of former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jim Shewart, President of Hofstra University, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's session of our conference on the presidency of Richard Nixon. I would like now to take a few moments to introduce the members of the platform party. First, I am very pleased to warmly welcome His Excellency Han Shu, the Ambassador of the People's Republic of China to the United States. Ambassador. The ambassador's wife, Madam Ji Yi-Yung, is in the audience. Madam Ji, will you please rise to be recognized? The next gentleman will be introduced a bit later as former Secretary of State, Dr. Henry A. Kissinger. Dr. Kissinger's mother, Paula, and his brother, Hofstra University trustee Walter B. Kissinger, who's here with his lovely wife, Eugenie. They're all in the audience, and would they please rise to be recognized? Next in the platform party is the Honorable Frank G. Zarb, who served in the Nixon and Ford administrations. He's chairman of the Hofstra University Board of Trustees and senior partner in the investment banking firm of Lazard Frere and Company. Mr. Zarb. The two co-directors of our conference, Dr. William F. Leventrosser, Professor of Political Science, and Professor Leon Friedman, Professor of Law. And finally, the Provost and Dean of Faculties at Hofstra, who will serve as moderator later in the program, Dr. Sanford Hammer. As many of you know, this is our 6th scholarly conference on the presidents of the United States who have served in the White House during Hofstra University's history. Earlier today, we heard from many outstanding scholars and from many former Nixon administration officials, as well as from other persons associated with the Nixon era. Tonight is a very special moment for Hofstra and for the conference, because we're privileged to hear an address by Dr. Henry Kissinger. I call now upon Provost Sanford Hammer to present Ambassador Han Shu, who will in turn introduce Dr. Kissinger. Dr. Hammer.
Thank you, President Shewart. I'm delighted to extend our hearty greetings and sincere welcome to His Excellency Han Shu, Ambassador of the People's Republic of China. It is indeed an honor for Hofstra University, Mr. Ambassador, to have you with us today. At an earlier session this afternoon, your wisdom enriched the examination of the topic, the opening of China. Tonight, the Ambassador has graciously consented to introduce our keynote speaker. Ambassador Han Shu was his nation's Director of Protocol at that historic time in 1973 when Dr. Kissinger made his secret trip to Beijing to make the arrangement for President Nixon's subsequent visit to China. Thus, he was on hand to greet Dr. Kissinger in Beijing at the start of the new era in Sino-American relations. His distinguished career in diplomacy began in 1949, when he served as section-chief and then assistant director of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Protocol Department. From 1963 to 1965, he was first secretary and counselor of the Chinese embassy in the Soviet Union. He later served as deputy director, acting director, and director of protocol in Beijing. When the People's Republic of China and the United States began their diplomatic exchange in 1973, he was appointed deputy chief with ambassadorial rank of his nation's liaison office in Washington, D.C. From 1979 to 1982, Ambassador Han was in Beijing as Director of American and Oceanian Affairs for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Following that assignment, he was appointed Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs. In May of 1985, he returned to the United States to present his credentials to President Reagan as the new ambassador to the United States. He is highly thought of in the Washington Diplomatic Corps as a man who works hard to build peaceful relations amongst nations. I am proud to present Ambassador Han Shu to you now. Ambassador.
Mr. Provost, thank you for your kind introduction. Mr. President Stewart, Mr. Chairman Zaab, conference guests, and participants, members of the Hofstra University community, ladies and gentlemen. It's my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Henry Kissinger, the keynote speaker at this evening's plenary session. Yet, I'm not so sure whether this introduction is necessary. It's certainly not in China. If you stop anyone on the street and ask about the living American he knows of, the answer would not be Bill Cosby or Michael Johnson. Most probably, it would be either President Nixon or Dr. Kissinger, and for good reason. Committed to Sino-U.S. friendship, Dr. Kissinger is held in high regard by both the Chinese leaders and people. He has made 14 trips to China and played a key role in executing the Nixon initiative that helped bring about the normalization and the consequent development of relations between our two great countries in the early 70s. Dr. Kissinger is now co-chairman of the U.S.-China Society, an influential organization set up last March with 3 former presidents as its honorary chairman. We in China admire Dr. Kissinger for what he has done to help bring our two countries together, and hope that he will make continued contribution to growing ties of China-U.S. friendship. I also speak from my personal experience. My friendship with Dr. Kissinger goes back 16 years ago when he made his first secret trip to China. As our acquaintance grows closer through numerous contacts, he has won my increasing respect and admiration for displaying a profound sense of political foresight, realism, understanding, and the flexibility in approaching complex issues. In these qualities, Dr. Kissinger truly stands unique. Once a friend asked me what secret weapon President Nixon used to open the door of China. My answer was that the secret weapon was Dr. Kissinger himself. For if someone less capable and intelligent than Dr. Kissinger should have been sent, the result might have been totally different. I think it's perfectly fitting that Dr. Kissinger has been asked to deliver the keynote speech. After all, who was more intimately involved in President Nixon's foreign policy initiatives than Dr. Kissinger? And who is more qualified to offer insights into the Nixon presidency than Dr. Kissinger, who worked closely with President Nixon during his presidency? Although Dr. Kissinger has left the office for a number of years, he has remained active in public life. More than once, his cool-headed and penetrating analysis of the intricate and changing international developments has been valuable to us in gaining a thorough understanding of the major global issues that affect the future of the world. I believe, and I'm sure, it's a belief shared by the audience that we can certainly expect an equally enlightening and thought-provoking presentation from Dr. Kissinger this evening. I'm as eager as all of you to benefit from Dr. Kissinger's keynote speech. I think that the best way to proceed my introduction is to stop it right now and let Dr. Kissinger take the platform. Now, Dr. Kissinger.
Mr. Ambassador, the President, the Czar, ladies and gentlemen, it means a lot to me to be introduced by my old friend, Chinese ambassador, who greeted me when I arrived in China, knew a lot more about me than I knew about China. In fact, he knew more about me than there was to know. And I've asked the Chinese on a number of occasions whether they would let me have their files on me, because it would help me in writing my autobiography. I was induced to come here by my old friend Frank Saab, who said, come to Hofstra and give a little speech on President Nixon. He didn't reveal to me that it was part of a 3-day conference attended by many former colleagues and media, and by some individual whose admiration for me does not quite equal that of my mother. And in any event, to talk about the foreign policy of President Nixon, which is the subject I'm most knowledgeable about, is a rather complex subject. Let me begin by stating a few propositions. I had the privilege of working intimately with President Nixon for 5.5 years. He appointed me to positions from which I could make a contribution to our country and maybe to world peace, despite the fact that I had spent all my previous experience supporting Governor Rockefeller, who was not known for his unquestioning views about President Nixon. Indeed, I had never met President Nixon, really, before he appointed me. I met him once for 5 minutes at a cocktail party, and cocktail party conversation was not a subject for which President Nixon will go down in history. I am proud of having had the privilege of working with President Nixon. I think he presided over the most significant period in American foreign policy, certainly of the post-war period. I was his associate, and I was his subordinate. And I make this point so that we can avoid the question of who did what. President Nixon had the responsibility. He had an extraordinary knowledge, and he has an extraordinary knowledge of foreign policy. And it is a sort of a fruitless exercise to try to segment decisions to see who contributed what part to what decision. You should also keep in mind that it is next to impossible to do justice to contemporary history. When I was a PhD student and wrote on 19th century history, ambassadors were 3 weeks away from their governments. Communications were handwritten, and the only instructions that could be given were conceptual. And therefore it was fairly easy to determine what the various people were thinking. In the modern period, with modern communication, the instructions are not conceptual. They instruct precisely what the various individuals are supposed to do. The British Foreign Office in the middle of the 19th century had 40 permanent officials. The State Department today has 15,000 permanent officials. The Defense Department has more. And they have typewriters and Xerox machines. And they produce an unbelievable quantity of material, most of which is never seen by decision makers. And I therefore warn you about investigative reporters who come with some hot document that has a top secret stamp on it in order to draw any conclusions. The documents that matter are those that went across the desks of the Secretary of State, the President, and the Security Advisor. And it's very hard to determine what these were from the mass of information. It's particularly difficult to do an objective historical analysis of President Nixon because he was one of, and is, one of the most complex human beings that one is likely to encounter. And I'm sure that all of us in this room who worked with him will be able to give a truthful account of quite different facets of his personality. I mention all of this in order to make clear that it is quite possible to have conflicting views. I will talk about Richard Nixon, the foreign policy president. I think the key element was that while President Nixon considered domestic politics a somewhat tawdry but necessary prerequisite to being in office, he considered foreign policy as involving the fundamental national interest and the ultimate responsibility to his country and to world peace. And I cannot think of one decision that was made in the foreign policy field, though people may dispute this, in which the motive was principally, or even importantly, domestic politics. In foreign policy, Richard Nixon attempted to determine the fundamental national interest, the long-term objective, and sometimes in excruciatingly extended conversations, work out a strategy to achieve it. Indeed, I would say the most important contribution that President Nixon attempted to make to American foreign policy was not in the initiatives that were taken, but in articulating an approach to foreign policy which could avoid the endless American oscillation between optimism and despair, the American obsession with personalities or abstract moral judgment. He tried to define something for which there is little historical experience and very little precedent, namely a permanent involvement of the United States in international affairs. I have brought with me excerpts from the annual report on foreign policy, which President Nixon submitted, the only president ever to have done so. Reports on which we spent many weeks of endless work, only to find that the only subject of it that was ever reported in the press was Vietnam. And that illustrates one of the dilemmas of the Nixon foreign policy presidency. He wanted to construct a new international order, but he inherited a war from which those who had involved us in it walked away, and passions that he had not originated, but that by temperament he was not perhaps ideally suited to deal with, which often obscured while he was in office the larger design at which he was working. But he has the consolation that that larger design is emerging more and more clearly in the sense that no subsequent president has been able to get away from the categories that were established in the Nixon period and from the basic premises of that period. Now, what were some of these premises? I will draw some of them from these annual reports simply to avoid the impression that this is an ex post facto analysis invented to suit contemporary conditions. We in the Nixon administration were convinced that by the end of the 1960s, a phase of American foreign policy had ended. The 40s and 50s witnessed America's involvement in world affairs, but from a posture that was more comparable to the conduct of domestic politics than of foreign policy. As late as 1950, the United States produced 52% of all the goods and services that were produced in the world. We had an atomic monopoly. And therefore, the question of security could be defined by analogy to the experience in World War II, aggression across clearly defined borders anywhere in the world. And the problem of political stability could be defined as economic recovery. And we had enough resources to take care of both of these. By the late 1960s, with or without the Vietnam War, but brought home sharply by the Vietnam War, it became clear that America's resources were no longer adequate for so global a role, and that the United States would have to conduct foreign policy the way other nations had to throughout their history, by setting priorities, by defining a national interest. And this ran totally counter to the American experience. In 1936, when the Nazis reoccupied the Rhineland, President Roosevelt asked the Secretary of State what the meaning of this was. And he received an answer that said it violated an agreement with France and maybe an agreement with Britain, but it violated no agreement with the United States, period. There was not one word of analysis that this changed the strategic situation in Europe, that it made a mockery of the French system of alliances, and that a new era was beginning. To think of American foreign policy in strictly political, in strictly moral and legal terms has been a dominant trend, and it is still a dominant trend. And therefore, what President Nixon attempted to do was to base his policy on the following analysis, which I draw from the annual report submitted to the Congress. That in the 40s and 50s, we were the only great power whose society and economy had escaped World War II. That in the 70s, this would no longer be the case, and we were living in a world that was no longer bipolar, but multipolar. That new nations were being born, often in turmoil and uncertainty, that would also be factors in international relations. In the 40s and 50s, we were facing a communist world that to us at least appeared monolithic. It was the perception of the Nixon presidency that the nature of that world had changed, and that we no longer faced a monolithic world in communism. And this, I must say, was written in '69, before we had the slightest contact with the People's Republic of China. We pointed out that the nature of military technology had changed and that we had to adapt to a period of approaching nuclear parity. And therefore, the basic principle was put forward that our objective is to define our interests precisely. And the more that policy is based on a realistic assessment of our and others' interests, the more effective our role in the world can be. We are not involved in the world because we have commitments, said this report. We have commitments because we are involved. Our interests must shape our commitments rather than the other way around. This was the basic thrust of the Nixon foreign policy. And it led to a situation in which the Nixon administration was attacked from both the liberal and the conservative side in the end. From the liberal side, because there was too much emphasis on power, and from the conservative side, because there was not enough emphasis on ideological conflict. And a strange coalition emerged after a while between conservatives who hated communists and liberals who hated Nixon and who felt that if Nixon was for peace, maybe a little confrontation wouldn't do any harm. And this, coinciding with Watergate, made the second term more complex than it should have been. But with this as a background, let me talk about the Nixon approach to the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, to the Middle East, to Europe, to some extent to Vietnam. I read in the papers occasionally, especially in the more conservative ones, about how President Nixon was mesmerized by détente and how he tried to envelop the Soviet Union into a web of relationships in which they would not notice that they were being tied down, and that in the process he made great concessions. Now those of us in this room who worked with President Nixon know that his confidence was limited in the unqualified goodwill of Americans. And therefore, to believe that he was taken in by Russians strains any credulity. President Nixon's approach to the Soviets was expressed in one of these reports as follows. We are under no illusions. We know that there are enduring ideological differences. We are aware of the difficulty of moderating tensions that arise from clashes of national interests. These differences will not be dissipated by changes of atmosphere or dissolved in cordial personal relations between statesmen. They involve strong convictions and contrary philosophies. The United States has interests of its own and will defend those interests. But any nation today must define its interests with special concerns for the interests of others. If some nations define their security in a manner that means insecurity for other nations, then peace is threatened and the security of all is diminished. This obligation is particularly great for the nuclear superpowers, on whose decisions the survival of mankind may well depend. The fundamental attempt of the Nixon administration was to attempt to define those actions which would in fact threaten fundamental national interests. It therefore placed less emphasis on ideological controversy and great emphasis on actual conduct. It resisted any attempt to expand the Soviet sphere or even to violate what we perceive to be an existing balance of power. But it was prepared to respect Soviet interests within its national borders. As early as 1969, for example, at a time when we had no relationships with the People's Republic of China, and when we didn't even know how to get in touch with the People's Republic of China, we feared in the summer of 1969 that the Soviet Union was considering an attack on the People's Republic of China. We may or may not have been correct in this judgment, and I'll be glad in the question period to tell you why we thought so. And I've never asked the ambassador whether they thought so. That was our conviction. We were prepared to do our utmost to prevent this and to give the maximum diplomatic and other support to the People's Republic of China, with which, I repeat, we had no relationship whatsoever, because we thought that such a move would so threaten the balance of power and therefore so fundamentally affect American interests that it had to be resisted, whatever the Chinese might think of us. At the same time, the Nixon administration was prepared to make concrete agreements with the Soviet Union on specific subjects. It attempted at the beginning to link political and arms control negotiations on the theory that tensions in the world had political causes and not only arms causes. Indeed, if you looked at history, you would find that almost every war you can identify has been caused by political tension and not simply by the development of arms. That effort founded on the resistance of the bureaucracy, which was ideologically committed to arms control as an end in itself. And therefore those two policies tended to go on somewhat different tracks. But nevertheless, in all the areas in which President Nixon had discretion, and in the end there were many, he never lost sight of the fact that unless one could achieve some restrained international conduct on the part of the Soviet Union, none of these arms control agreements could possibly last. A lot of discussion has taken place about the various principles of conduct that we signed with the Soviet Union. we never believed that simply signing these agreements would lead to restrained conduct. But we thought it was the beginning of a set of negotiations that over a period of time could be used to test whether the Soviet Union was prepared to keep its military power inside its borders, rather than insist on defining security by the physical occupation of neighboring territories. The various arms control agreements that were signed in that period have become highly controversial, and there's no point in going into their detail today. But especially the students here will not remember a period in which there were almost monthly massive demonstrations in the streets, in which the Congress was reducing the military budget by significant percentages in each year, and in which the president had to fight for the most elementary sinews of national strength against a heavy media and congressional opposition. It is very easy today, for example, to speak about the ballistic missile defense treaty of 1972. But you should remember that President Nixon managed to achieve approval of the concept of ballistic missile defense in 1969 by exactly one vote, that of the Vice President. That the system that was then developed was based on 12 defensive sites. That every year thereafter, the Congress reduced the number of these sites, so that by the year 1972, we were down to 2 sites to defend the whole of the United States. So that the only question was whether we could get anything for it before the Congress gave it away unilaterally. And all the mock heroes who are now speaking about how tough they would have been never put it in the context of that period. With all of this, President Nixon, in my view, put relations with the Soviet Union on a more realistic basis than it was before or since, precisely because he was insisting on a cool analysis of the national interest. He spoke a language that Soviet leaders understood. There's no possibility that a Soviet leader can return from a meeting with an American president and tell his colleagues that he has just met the most charming American president, and that therefore they should make concessions they had not previously thought of. And nobody will claim that President Nixon at any point in his career relied on personal charm to have his way. Since he dealt with the Soviet leaders without illusion, they developed a relationship of mutual respect that led to a series of fundamental agreements that incidentally are still being observed today, have been observed in every administration, and been carried out by every critic that subsequently took office. Now, let me turn to the People's Republic of China. President Nixon entered office convinced that one could not conduct a serious foreign policy that excluded a quarter of the human race. President Nixon came to that view before he ever met me, and therefore that should settle the argument of who thought of it first. I had come to the same conclusion independently, so there was no argument on the subject. But there's no question that President Nixon was dedicated to improving relations with the People's Republic of China. He did so on the basis that China had always been, throughout its history, perhaps the decisive factor in the history of Asia, that it had a long border with the Soviet Union and borders with Southeast Asia and indeed all major Asian countries. The problem we had was that we didn't know how to approach the People's Republic of China. At first, we tried various communist countries without any success. Partly, I suspect, because the leaders in Beijing thought that the other communist countries were too closely allied with Moscow for them to entrust sensitive messages to them. We wrote in our annual report about our commitment to improving relations with the People's Republic of China. And we made clear in our very first report, about 9 months after President Nixon came into office, that we would avoid dramatic gestures which might produce dramatic rebuffs, but that we would take specific steps that did not require at first Chinese agreement, but which underlined our willingness to have a more normal and constructive relationship. In due course, answers were received through the Pakistan channel from the Chinese leadership. And then there started a relationship that remains of the greatest importance. It is almost the only major American relationship that has remained free of partisan controversy for 16 years now, in a series of administrations of both parties. It was a complex relationship because at first the United States did not even recognize the government in Beijing with which it was dealing. And the ambassador knows the agonies we went through in trying to find a formula in our first communique that reflected the fact that we at least accepted the proposition that there was only one China. And we finally came up with a formula that all Chinese on both sides of the Taiwan Straits affirm that there's only one China. The United States does not contest that proposition. Having spent months working out that formula, we then submitted it to the bureaucracy, and somebody said, "How do you know all Chinese on both sides of the Taiwan Straits have these views?" So I think we changed it to say the Chinese, and it translates in Chinese in the same way. So no damage was done. Now, the interesting thing about the relationship between the United States and the People's Republic, especially in the Nixon period, was that we really had very little actual diplomatic business to conduct with each other. On the other hand, the only detailed interest we had with each other was a common concern with preventing what we called hegemony, which meant the domination of the world by one country or a group of countries. Most of the time of our diplomatic relationship was spent on a careful explanation by each side to the other of how they viewed international relations. The Chinese never asked anything from us, and I don't remember that we ever asked anything of the Chinese of a concrete nature. Gradually some concrete things developed, but they were of secondary importance in the first 5 or 6 years. But by working through a series of remarkable leaders on both sides, on the common perception of international affairs, they developed not only confidence, but a certain parallelism, especially on the overriding issue of maintaining the international equilibrium. Now let me say a few words about the Middle East. In the Middle East, we faced a situation in which Israel had occupied, after the 1967 war, large territories in Egypt, on the West Bank, and on the Golan Heights, in which the Arabs did not recognize Israel, and in which some 20,000 Soviet troops were located in Egypt. President Nixon received a great deal of advice to get negotiations started. He believed that it was, above all, important to make clear that the United States could not be blackmailed into pressuring friendly countries by the presence of Soviet troops. And we had to conduct a very complex diplomacy, whose first objective was to show to the moderate Arabs that while the Soviets could deliver weapons, only America could bring progress towards peace. And I can think of no area in which the personal convictions of the top leaders were of more crucial importance. So President Nixon dragged his feet on many of the procedural issues by which are so often a substitute for substance. But also when in 1973 a war broke out, after Soviet troops had been asked to leave, he was determined that the opportunity be used to make a breakthrough towards peace. And from the first day of the war on, we conducted ourselves in such a manner that while we would prevent the defeat of Israel, we would also try to lay the basis for a negotiated peace. And many of the breakthroughs in Middle East diplomacy date to that period. I don't want to go through every aspect of the Nixon foreign policy, but I must say a few words about Vietnam. President Nixon's greatest ambition was, as I said, to create a new structure of international relations. And in that, his relations with Europe were of cardinal importance. However, much of the first term was taken up with ending the war in Vietnam. When President Nixon came into office, there were 520,000 Americans in Vietnam, and the number was still increasing on a timetable established in the previous administration. The Democratic Party, which had engaged us in that war, had been deeply divided on the issue of the war, leading to extraordinary demonstrations in the streets of Chicago at the time. What is generally not recognized is that President Nixon carried out the minority plank of the Democratic Party that was not accepted by the then administration within 6 months of coming into office. Now, I mention this because so often the issue is defined in terms of prolonging the war, or of ending, or of not being willing to end the war. Nobody who inherited such a tragedy could have any other desire than ending the war. I had come from Harvard University. I was closely tied emotionally, both to my students and to my colleagues. But what the people who claimed a monopoly on peace, on the desire for peace, would never face is that what the North Vietnamese wanted was not a compromise, but victory. We proposed to the Vietnamese, even before President Nixon entered office, in a personal message, to separate the military and the political discussions, to have a ceasefire and a mutual withdrawal, and to leave the political issues to the Vietnamese parties. This was not only rejected, but within 3 weeks of coming into office, we faced an offensive that killed over 1,000 Americans every month. 2/3 of the casualties of the Nixon administration, it is generally not recognized, were suffered in the first year of the war. And of those, in turn, 3/5 of the casualties in the first were over 9,000 or 8,000 in the first 6 months of the war, before any policies he carried out could have any effect. The fundamental problem faced by the Nixon administration was this. The Vietnamese were asking us to withdraw unconditionally, to overthrow on the way out all those who had associated with us, and then to leave the subsequent evolution to their tender mercies, which we have now seen in the boat people and in the mass killings in Cambodia. There were never any other terms. And all the people who now say that we could have had in 1969 the terms that were that we finally settled for in 1972 are playing games with the honor of the American people and with the sentiments of the American people. We said from the beginning that we were prepared to withdraw provided there was a political process in place in which we were not asked to turn over the millions that had relied on us to their enemies. That condition was not met until October 8th, 1972. The terms which we then accepted had been proposed publicly, had been proposed secretly in May 1971, had been proposed publicly in January 1972, and had been repeated publicly in May 1972, and had always been attacked by our critics as being far too stringent and would never be accepted. The question was whether America would end a war, which the Nixon administration had not started, by abandoning all the people who, in reliance on our word, had committed themselves to the political processes that we had put forward as a people. President Nixon had nothing to gain personally from such a course. But he also felt that a president had no right to turn off a major policy like as if it were switching a television channel. And it was presumptuous of so many outsiders to pretend that they had a monopoly on anguish, and they had a monopoly on virtue, and that those of us who had to conduct a war which we had inherited under unbelievable harassment were doing it because there were some psychological proclivities in that direction. I have spent this much time on the Vietnam War because it explains why the ultimate design could not be carried out in the Nixon administration. There were at least three problems. One is that President Nixon was not emotionally the best leader for the kind of civil war that was being conducted on the issue of Vietnam, and sometimes on the pretext of Vietnam, against the fundamental institutions of America. It touched too many insecurities in him and brought out too many defensive attitudes. Secondly, he was too solitary a personality to be a great educator of the American people, to move it from its moralistic and legalistic tradition to a perception of a permanent involvement in international affairs on the basis of an analysis of the national interest, constantly adjusting equilibrium. And thirdly, it was so ambitious an undertaking that in the end, he was attacked, as I've said, by both liberals and conservatives, because he was running against deep-seated preconceptions and fundamental nostalgias. And yet, when all is said and done, none of his successors have been able to avoid the basic categories. None have been able to think of other categories in the Middle East, in East-West relations, in US-China relations, and in Europe. And so he will have left a major legacy. Let me conclude by reading to you, which is probably a rather low thing to do, from the conclusion of the first volume of my memoirs, because it sums up my assessment of President Nixon, and it stresses some aspect of his personality. Let me read this to you. Around midnight, when I was at home, Nixon called from the Lincoln sitting room where he was alone. He was wondering whether the press would appreciate what had been done. Probably not. But that was not what he really had on his mind. He knew, he said, that every success brings a terrific letdown, and I should not let it get to me. I should not be discouraged. There were many battles yet to fight. I should not weaken. In fact, I was neither discouraged, nor did I feel let down. Listening to him, I could picture the scene. Nixon would be sitting solitary and withdrawn in his brown stuffed chair with his legs on the settee in front of him, a small reading light breaking the darkness, and a wood fire throwing shadows on the wall of the room. The loudspeakers would be playing romantic classical music, probably Tchaikovsky. He was talking to me, but he was really addressing himself. What extraordinary vehicles destiny selects to accomplish its designs. This man, so lonely in his hour of triumph, so ungenerous in some of his motivations, had navigated our nation through one of its most anguishing periods in its history. Not by nature courageous, he had steeled himself to conspicuous acts of extraordinary courage. Not normally outgoing, he had forced himself to rally his people to his challenge. He had striven for a revolution in American foreign policy so that it would overcome the disastrous oscillations between overcommitment and isolation. Despised by the establishment, ambiguous in his human perceptions, he had yet held fast to a sense of national honor and responsibility, determined to prove that the strongest free country in the world had no right to abdicate. What would have happened had the establishment, about which he was so ambivalent, shown him some love? Would he have withdrawn deeper into the wilderness of his resentments, or would an act of grace have liberated him? By now, it no longer mattered. Enveloped in an intractable solitude, at the end of a period of bitter division, he nevertheless saw before him a vista of promise to which few statesmen have been blessed to aspire. He could envisage a new international order that would reduce lingering enmities, strengthen friendships, and give new hope to emerging nations. It was a worthy goal for America and mankind. He was alone in his moment of triumph on a pinnacle that was soon to turn into a precipice. And yet, with all his insecurities, he had brought us by a tremendous act of will to an extraordinary moment when dreams and possibilities conjoined. 2 nights before his resignation, we were discussing his role in history, and he was deeply despondent. I said to him, history will treat you more kindly than your contemporaries. And I believe that this conference is a proof that this process is well on the way. Thank you very much.
Henry Alfred Kissinger has played more than a major role in formulating American foreign policy. He is a recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating an end to hostilities with North Vietnam. His wisdom and his skill also led to the ceasefire between Israel and Egypt after the disengagement of their troops and the disengagement of their troops after the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. Born in Fürth, Germany, he came to the United States with his family when he was 12 years old. He received his bachelor's degree, summa cum laude, and his master's and PhD degrees at Harvard University. As a leading expert on international relations and nuclear defense policy, Dr. Kissinger taught at Harvard and served as a consultant to government agencies and foundations. He served Presidents Nixon and Ford as Assistant for National Security Affairs and Secretary of State. Dr. Kissinger helped initiate the strategic arms limitation talks with the Soviet Union. And he is today one of this nation's outstanding public figures and a great American. Mr. President, I'm very pleased to present Henry Alfred Kissinger as a candidate for the Hofstra University Presidential Medal.
Henry Alfred Kissinger, Hofstra University applauds your accomplishments in academia and in public service. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the ranks of the distinguished recipients of the Hofstra University Presidential Medal and to present that award to you now. With it goes our hearty congratulations and sincere good wishes. Sir, congratulations to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Kissinger has kindly consented to answer questions from the audience. There are microphones at the front of the playhouse on both aisles and in the balcony as well. If you would like to ask a question, please come forward, and after I recognize you, please speak into the microphone, identify yourself, ask your question. Because of time limitations, please try to be brief and frame your questions as succinctly as possible. We can only entertain questions and not discussions or essays in order to provide the maximum number of people with an opportunity to ask their question. And let's begin right down here. Donna?
Dr. Kissinger, you have described the way the Congress was giving away the ABM almost faster than the administration could negotiate that treaty. In your judgment, would the Congress in the mid-70s have proceeded to give away South Vietnam and undo your peace settlement, even had Mr. Nixon not damaged himself and ultimately been driven out by Watergate?
We will never be able to prove this. We negotiated this agreement on the assumption that making the settlement would unify the American people, that those who wanted peace would be satisfied with the fact that the war had ended, and those who wanted honor would feel that we had met at least their minimum requirements. We took it for granted that assistance to Vietnam would continue, and also we took it for granted that we would have the right to maintain this accord against egregious violations. A mythology has developed according to which President Nixon secretly promised President Yu that he would support him in case there were violations. First of all, we said so publicly, and any of you who want to check on this can look in the appendix of the second volume of my memoirs. You'll find 5 pages of public statements in which it was said. Secondly, it is inherent in the nature of an agreement. If you make a peace agreement that you are not willing to enforce, you have engaged in unconditional surrender, because then the other side can break it at will, and it will. And secondly, we thought that the level of aid that we had given, which was about $2 billion, could be maintained. The Congress cut the aid to Vietnam from $2 billion to $1 billion to $750 million in successive years, at the same time legislating an absolute prohibition against any American military assistance, regardless of the scale of violation. And our assumption that the Vietnamese could defend themselves against the forces that were in their country, but that we would have a right to defend them if there were a massive infiltration, simply was not borne out. Now, would we have been able to maintain the agreement? I believe that without Watergate, the North Vietnamese would have been very reluctant to challenge President Nixon again. But it can never be proved. But that does not change the reality. We had a duty to see to it that these sacrifices were not in vain, and we did not fulfill that duty.
Take the next question from the other side.
My name is Stephen Gilroy, Mr. Kissinger. You had the responsibility of accepting Mr. Nixon's letter of resignation formally. And I was wondering how you felt when you had to do that, and if you believed he resigned too early, too late, if you think he should resign at all, and really, after he did resign, do you believe his expertise and his knowledge is being used as best it can be, or do you think there should be a formalized role for ex-presidents, especially President Nixon?
I found the whole process of resignation one of the most searing experiences of my life. I think that many wrong things had been committed. I did not believe that it should lead to resignation, that there were other remedies available, though by the time President Nixon resigned, there was no other choice. I found it extremely painful and a shattering human experience to have to witness this. The letter of resignation was not handed to me by President Nixon personally. He was on an airplane. I think he was over Kansas when he ceased being president. The letter was handed to me by General Haig. But that was not the painful part. The painful part was the week preceding it and the process, because one could not have served with President Nixon without having some ambivalences. But one also could not have served with President Nixon without knowing what his ultimate aspirations were, especially in the foreign policy field. And to see all of this thwarted as a result of what were essentially personality flaws was in the face of a really great opportunity, was a very great sadness.
Next question on this side, please.
My name is Ian Wilder. Dr. Kissinger, considering that you're often mentioned in articles concerning Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution about non-native-born citizens being unable to run for the presidency, and that General Haig is running for the presidency in '88, I thought you might want to enter the fray along with everybody else and give us your thoughts about the upcoming race.
Well, I have made a proposal to solve this problem, which is to make Bavaria the 51st state of the Union.
Next question.
Dr. Kissinger, as you stated that China was a diplomatic unknown, relatively speaking, in 1969. And with the memory of China entering the Korean conflict, I believe, in 1950, what were the political and military strategists thinking in, say, 1964 and 65 by entering the conflict against North Vietnam, not knowing what China, looming on the border of North Vietnam, was going to do?
Well, the people who entered the war in 1964 and 65 did so on a number of wrong assumptions. But I want to stress on the basis of extremely honorable motives. And I have always rejected the arguments that they had imperialistic or any other designs. Their assumption was, which turned out to be wrong, that China and the Soviet Union were in an alliance with each other. That we had developed a strategy for stopping nuclear war and for stopping conventional war, but we had not yet proved that we were capable of stopping guerrilla war. And therefore, we wanted to prove in Vietnam that we could stop guerrilla war. Now, how we could get to the view that China and the Soviet Union were allied 5 years after the Soviet Union had withdrawn all of its advisors from China, I cannot tell you. As late as the time that I came to Washington, it was an operating assumption in Washington, not so much that China and the Soviet Union were allied, but that China was actively encouraging the war in Vietnam, and that in the conflict between China and the Soviet Union, China was the aggressor. It was not until one day in San Clemente, when I had some spare time, and I plotted on a map the place where the incidents took place, and I noticed that they all took place very close to Soviet supply points and very far from Chinese supply points. And since we had never thought of the Chinese as anything but intelligent, we knew they wouldn't start conflicts very far from their lines of supply. That's when it dawned on us that the Soviets were the ones that were exercising the pressure. But now to go back to 64, it was a mistaken assumption that got us into the war. But the motive was to maintain the freedom of the people of Vietnam. Did that justify 500,000 American troops? Almost certainly not. It was a mistake. I do not believe, incidentally, that China would ever have entered the war in Vietnam against us unless we had gone very close to its border. So I do not believe that China would have entered the war actively against us, though it did give some support to the Vietnamese, to the North Vietnamese government. But it was, I can't say anything else than that there was a massive misunderstanding. But you will find statements by Secretary of State Rusk linking Beijing and Moscow as being the two organizers of the war in Vietnam.
Before the next question, let me just announce that the audio cassettes of this evening's session are available at the conference registration area immediately after the session ends. Now, next question.
Dr. Kissinger, we're often told about leaders of foreign countries perceiving Watergate as some trifling experience. They just quite couldn't understand what all the fuss was about. I was wondering if you might share with us an anecdote or two that would draw on your experiences with foreign leaders from the time. How did they really feel about Watergate?
I would say I can think of almost no exception to this rule. every foreign leader that I knew and that I dealt with could not believe what was going on here. At first, nobody took it all that seriously. At first, they thought this was one of these American extravagances that would go away very quickly, and actually that saved us quite a bit vis-a-vis the Soviets, because we got through the 1973 Middle East War without the Soviets understanding how weak our executive authority had become. When we went on alert in October '73, I had to spend most of the press conference in which I explained this, justifying what we had done against the charge that this was a gimmick to escape Watergate. So most of the foreign leaders couldn't understand the charges. Almost all of them were hoping that Nixon would survive and that it would end. I don't think I should go into the views as they were expressed by various individual leaders, but I'm sure there were some exceptions. But of the major figures we dealt with, I don't know one who did not look at this spectacle with dismay. That doesn't mean they justified everything that was done under the name of Watergate, but they were hoping for an unbroken executive authority. Much as last year during the Iran-Contra affair, most foreign leaders were hoping, regardless of what they thought of the merit of the arguments, that the executive authority of the United States would be maintained. And that was probably true even in the Soviet Union.
Question here.
Could you shed some light on the...
And that was probably true even in the Soviet Union.
Question here.
Could you shed some light on the correct interpretation of the 1972 ABM Treaty as it impacts Star Wars, the debate between President Reagan and Senator Nunn, among others?
I believe that this is basically a political decision that has to be made, and that you cannot deduce it entirely from legal arguments. And it is particularly dangerous to try to deduce it on the basis of cable traffic. I can give you one example of what happened, of what can happen in these cables. We received a cable once from our negotiators, in which the negotiator said, one of the negotiators said, I have reason to believe that the Soviet Union would consider the following proposal. And then a highly complicated proposal emerged. I saw the Soviet ambassador. I said, I will never understand you Soviets. Why would you put in such a complicated proposal at Geneva, where every colonel can shoot at it, when you could come here, give it to me, I could take it to President Nixon, and I could let you know within 48 hours whether there's anything that can be done with it. Well, he said, that's funny, I've never seen this, and in our system, we don't do separate channels, which you couldn't say of our system, I must tell you. Well, after about 2 weeks, it emerged that the following had happened. The American had gone to the Soviets and said, what would you think of the following proposal? And the Soviet had said, if you submit it, we'll consider it. So he had reported quite accurately, I have reason to believe that the Soviets would consider the following proposal, but he hadn't told us that he had put it forward. So you go through these cables, and I tell you, my personal recollection, not supported by documents, it's the following. First of all, this was not a big issue to us, because there was no space defense. My recollection is that our delegation wanted very much to get the strict interpretation because they were ideologically opposed to ABM, as most arms controllers are on the ground, that if you give any alternative to mass destruction, you encourage nuclear war. It's a different theory. We authorized them to put it forward because we had no particular reason not to do this. My recollection is that it was always rejected on the ground that you cannot limit what doesn't exist. And that at some point I got impatient with our negotiators for putting forward the so-called strict interpretation. That's my recollection. Now, if you go nitpicking through the cables, it is possible that you come up with another interpretation. It is also quite possible that in 1972, when the delegation briefed the Senate on what the treaty meant, that they were telling the Senate what they had tried to sell the Soviets. And we in the White House at that time, being engaged in negotiations with the Soviets, with the Chinese, and with the Vietnamese, were not reading every testimony that everybody was giving. So my instinct is that, certainly psychologically, the broad interpretation is correct. It's more nearly correct than the strict interpretation. I also believe that the issue cannot be settled on a legalistic basis. I believe that the administration should say what it wants to test, why it wants to test it, why it is essential, and then if anybody considers that contrary to the treaty, either modify the treaty or see what happens. The Soviets have built a radar the size of 3 football fields 1,000 miles from where it's permitted to be under the ABM treaty, so it is not beyond the wit of man to adjust it to necessity. That's what I would recommend on that. I would not base my case on my recollection, although I think I'm correct, at least from the psychological point of view, that is what happened as we perceived it in the White House. But it was not a big issue to us.
Take the next question from the balcony, please.
Dr. Kissinger, my name is Glenn Korn. Earlier on you said that during President Nixon's presidency he placed less emphasis on ideology and more emphasis on actual conduct in dealing with the Soviets. In your opinion, has the Reagan administration been able to follow in this tradition and place less emphasis on ideology and more emphasis in actual conduct in dealing with the government in Managua today?
No, I think the Reagan administration has oscillated from extreme ideology to extreme conciliation, which has been the fate of American foreign policy, and which is exactly what President Nixon was trying to avoid.
Next question right here, please.
Dr. Kissinger, my name is David Grand. I found it rather surprising that you repeatedly referred to the Vietnam War as a democratic commitment, because I always figured that it was a perfect example of bipartisan foreign policy. And I was wondering whether you and Richard Nixon supported our involvement in the Vietnam War prior to taking office.
I did not mean to imply that the Republicans were opposed and the Democrats were for it. I wanted to make the more limited point that most of the officials, President Johnson and Dean Rusk, with notable exception, that had made the actual decisions to get us into the war, then joined the peace movement. That was my objection. Not that they were wrong in getting us into the war, but that many of them were wrong in not helping us extricate ourselves from a war in which they had not taken the first step along the line that they were recommending as soon as they were out of it. That is my only thing. My own view on Vietnam, when it started, my major interest had been in Europe. So in 1963, when we first put 20,000 troops in, I remember talking to Walt Rostow once, and I asked him, how can we prevail with 20,000 troops but the French couldn't do it with 150,000? And he treated me with total contempt because he said I didn't understand mobility, and I didn't know whether Then in 1965, I went to Vietnam as a consultant to Ambassador Lodge, and I became convinced that the war could not be won the way it was being fought, and maybe not at all. But I also became convinced that we could no longer pull out without a just settlement, and therefore I supported the war from that point of view. And what I would have advised had I been asked before troops were put in there, I cannot tell you. I think now, in retrospect, that if America puts troops someplace, it must win, and that the mistake all administrations made, including the one in which I served, was to try to find a compromise in a civil war which does not lend itself to compromise. I do not blame the previous administration for going in. They made an honest mistake of judgment, and I almost certainly would have supported it if the issue had come up, and I certainly never opposed it, and to the best of my knowledge, President Nixon always supported it. The problem was that our national unity was broken in the Nixon period, and for me as the negotiator to come to Paris and tell the Vietnamese, here is our bottom line, and they say, come on now, the following leading figures have already proposed 6 advances over your position, so there was never any floor on which we could stand. This was the tragedy, not what happened before we came in.
Over here.
Good evening, Dr. Kissinger. Throughout your dissertation tonight, I noticed that you had undertaken 5 major foreign policy aspects regarding the topics you mentioned. However, during your term as Secretary of State, you've also conducted your affairs, as you mentioned, from one of initial opposition to striving towards conciliation. But how can you explain the American rationale behind the Turkish invasion of Cyprus back in 1974 and the chronic problem? The rationale behind it and the chronic problem that continues to exist.
Look, the Turkish invasion of Cyprus occurred in July 1974. In the last 3 weeks of the Nixon administration. It occurred a week after we returned from a summit in Moscow, which itself had been a source of endless controversy in our government, because as the authority of the president was diminishing, everybody felt he could take a free shot at President Nixon. So at that moment, the Greek government decided to overthrow Makarios. Now you can say, why didn't we know about it? Well, I could ask you, why didn't Makarios know about it? He had more at stake than we did. These coups usually succeed because even the person most interested didn't catch on. Besides, the idea of putting an adventurer in there was so against all probability, and we weren't watching it. And if we had watched it, I don't know what we could have done. So then it was always fairly predictable that at the next crisis in Cyprus, the Turks would come in. We tried to procrastinate for as long as possible, for a long time, by starting all sets of negotiations. The problem was that during the first 10 days of the Cyprus crisis, there was a military government in Greece, and everybody was telling us to bring pressure on the Greeks, which would have accelerated a Turkish invasion, which then, in fact, took place. Now, in the last 3 weeks of the Nixon administration, to assume that we could have intervened militarily against Turkey on behalf of the Greek colonels is beyond all credulity. Now, in a functioning administration, maybe I would have gotten on an airplane and try to see whether I could get the thing under control. But anyway, the British thought this was their responsibility. They had an agreement, and I don't know whether I could have gotten it under control. But the last 4 weeks of the Nixon administration were a very difficult process, and we, to us, the Cyprus problem was one, unforeseen, secondly, primarily a British responsibility, and thirdly, I don't know what we could have done in any event, because people forget today that the Turks invaded Cyprus when the Greek colonels were still in charge. And it was only after the Turkish invasion that the colonels were overthrown. And then the Greeks developed elaborate theories that we had cooked it all up. And, you know, I can understand they don't want to take responsibility for their own follies. But we had enough troubles of our own at that time without getting involved in Cyprus. And believe me, nobody had the time to say, let's have a little coup in Cyprus here.
What about the problem that continues?
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Kissinger has given generously of his time, and we'll take one more question from the balcony.
Dr. Kissinger, do you ever think Iranian-American relations will blossom again like they did during the Nixon administration?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Do you think Iranian-American relations will ever prosper again like they did during the Nixon administration?
I don't believe that Iranian-U.S. relations will ever be as they were in the Nixon administration. Incidentally, in fairness, one has to say the fact that relations with Iran were good was not an exclusive credit to President Nixon. They had been excellent while the Shah was in office with every American administration. Now, with respect to Iran, I believe I tend to share what I take to be the Chinese analysis, namely that it is a crucial country to the equilibrium of the area, that the present regime there is not necessarily a permanent regime. They have a long frontier with the Soviet Union. Historically, the invasions of Iran have almost invariably come from what is today Soviet, was previously Russian, and previously yet other territory, so that we should keep open as an intellectual possibility that at some point relations with Iran can improve. And while I thought it was a big mistake to trade arms for hostages, the idea that a dialogue might start with Iran was not wrong, except they did it in a clumsy way. And in this connection, I would like to say one thing. One of the Nixon administration was marked by a series of spectacular initiatives. And many of the successors look only at the spectaculars and think they can start with them. In fact, the spectaculars were the result, in every case, of years of meticulous, patient, detailed preparation. The ambassador knows that before we came to China, there had been 3 years of, or nearly 3 years of very subtle exchanges, and we had a pretty good idea, not of exactly what we would find, but of the mood we would find. Before we had our breakthroughs in the Middle East, we had endured 4 years of battering by the bureaucracy, by the radicals, by the Soviets. And too many people think that they can just go to the last phase and start undertaking missions without having created the objective conditions. But to answer your question, yes, I think that as a historic phenomenon, I believe that relations with Iran can improve, that the geopolitical necessities should require us to look at Iran as a major player and not to get into unnecessary confrontations with them, but of course to resist those things that threaten our friends in the area.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our program.
This has been an address by Henry Kissinger at Hofstra University Symposium on President Richard Nixon. We'll return with more highlights from this conference in a moment.